our first guest for this session has been working precisely at the interface between the digital and the technology. Just from June 1st, he got a new job. He's now leading the innovation in this domain at the Knight Foundation. But before that, for 5 years, he was the director of the research and development unit of the New York Times. My big pleasure now is to introduce Marc Lavallee.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you everyone for being here today. This is my first in-person presentation in several years, and I was willing to get on a plane and come to Switzerland than do one more Zoom presentation, so thank you. As mentioned, Marc Lavallee, I'm now with Knight Foundation, previously at a number of other news organizations, and really for the last 20 years at this intersection of journalism and technology. I'm going to talk mostly about my time at the New York Times today, and some of the examples that I'm going to run through. So, news organizations, like many organizations these days, face a challenge of, particularly when it comes to innovation. There are thousands of things we can possibly do every single day in the news cycle, and there are only a few things that we can actually take action on. And so I think what we've found over the years is that a lot of innovation is actually deciding where to focus and going through and really finding ways to improve that decision-making process. So, when we built out a new research and development team at the New York Times, the beginning of the process looks very much like innovation. We've got sticky notes, we have strange devices, there's all kinds of collaboration happening. People walking by this in the newsroom say like, okay, the future is in there somewhere. But we also had a lot of pressure to actually show what this means to readers ultimately. So all this cool innovation ultimately needs to become tools that reporters can use and that people can see. We need to try these things out, in this case at the Oscars, to be able to help file photos more quickly. And ultimately, you need to find a way to get Brad Pitt onto the New York Times. So that is sort of how we set up the innovation to be able to go from the pure research all the way out to implementation and into readers' hands. One of the ways that we figured out how to do this over and over again, there are many models. A lot of them are the same, whether it's design thinking or something else. We use this that has been used in a bunch of places. I think it started with fighter pilots in World War II, of observing your environment, orienting yourself around the way that you want to frame a solution, deciding what you're going to do, and ultimately acting. So this is Googleable. You can find this. There are a lot of people who use it. I'm going to walk through each of these steps and show a few examples of how we apply this to journalism. So first, in talking about observation, it's very easy for news organizations to think about their organization outward and have an idea of who their audience is without ever actually getting out of the building and really confirming that. And so one of the things that we borrowed is this framework called Jobs to be Done. This is a pretty well-known framework. One of the best academics on innovation, Clayton Christensen, wrote a book about this a handful of years ago. And what it really helps do is put yourself in the mindset of consumers who decide if your product will solve a problem for them or not, and they essentially will either hire your product to solve the problem or they will fire the product if they find something better. One of the best examples I've come across is about McDonald's milkshakes. So very American here. McDonald's wanted to sell more milkshakes. They started looking at the data and realized that more than half of milkshakes are sold before 8:30 in the morning. And they wanted to know why. It turned out that a lot of people purchased milkshakes at the beginning of a long driving commute to work every morning. Another American problem. And the reason was that you could eat it one-handed, it would last a while, so they wouldn't be done with it immediately. And so they were going into a McDonald's looking for breakfast, and this was the best option available. So they were essentially hiring a milkshake, which we think of as more of a dessert type thing, for breakfast, because that's what they had to work with. So what McDonald's was able to do is realize they could make other things that solved that problem, but they could also just make it easier for people to get milkshakes in the morning, which is maybe one solution to the problem. But they did increase milkshake sales sevenfold. Right? Just by thinking differently and trying to understand what it was that led people to want to purchase a milkshake in the morning, they had a much better understanding of how to serve that need. So the best example I have of this of my entire career that I draw a lot of inspiration from is a site called 538, which started back in the 2008 presidential election cycle. And what the person who created this site, and still running today, Nate Silver, what he realized was that there is a way to be able to take all of the polling data that happens around a presidential election and answer the question people want an answer to, which is who is going to be elected president, not 6 months ahead of the election in one state, who's ahead and who's behind. And he did this by applying statistics to all of the polls and weighting them based on their prior accuracy and their methodology and all these things that he understood as an expert in this field. But he did so in a way that, again, answered the question that people wanted, right? So a lot of people ended up hiring 538 to serve this need over many months of the election cycle, and in some ways fired other publications that were doing it the old-fashioned way, like the Washington Post and New York Times and things like that. So the Times ended up hiring him later on, and this model of predictive journalism has been replicated in a bunch of other places as well, because it's just a much better way of thinking about a need from a consumer or reader perspective. So that's been really helpful in thinking about when we want to apply emerging technologies and when we want to try new things, are we doing it in a way that's actually solving a person's need, or are we just trying something out because it seems new and cool and interesting? Another big leap for us was in orienting the way that we did our research around ultimately trying to, not surprisingly, publish journalism. Think about areas of emerging technology and boiling them down to how they can help us with a specific story. So one example here is a few years back, we were doing a lot with computer vision in this field of computer vision called pose estimation, right? To really be able to understand, in this case, you have a tennis match at the US Open. Using computer vision, how can we understand more of what's actually happening with the gameplay? This was really interesting. We had a person on staff who was doing this for the better part of a year, and he was just trying one thing after another to try to figure out where the story was. So charts and visuals are just kind of flying out of his desk, so he could see all the footfalls. You could turn it into a heat map, things like that. But the challenge was for us was trying to take what he was working on and actually put it in the context of a story that people would be interested in, right? Who would hire the New York Times to understand something better about tennis that would be driven by computer vision? So in absence of that, after spending a lot of time, what we did was we changed direction, and we were lucky. Some of the silver linings of the pandemic, where with the Olympics last summer in Tokyo, we had an extra year to work on something for that. So we switched gears to swimming, and we did some stuff with track and field as well. So we were able to apply a lot of the same stuff that we'd worked on to, this is mapping the heads of swimmers in the pool, and with one of our folks on site, getting 30 frames per second of every swimming match. What we were able to do is get a highly detailed understanding of the exact speed and differential in speed of every swimmer, again, 30 frames a second. So we could ultimately take something like this and put it into a visual to be able to explain something in a way that I think is really hard to understand when you're watching swimming at the Olympics on television, where the difference between a gold medal and fourth place can be just a couple of seconds in the case of this relay, of understanding exactly where and who and how the team won, the Australian team, and for certain bursts that you saw, whether or not those are actually effective in being able to place on the medal podium. So this is an example of being able to work with the data and work with colleagues in the newsroom to be able to really understand what's a story that's interesting, that wants to be told, that's taking the technology and working with it. And I think the other thing about this is, when you start thinking about applications of technology like this in the context of stories, it's a lot easier to explain to colleagues in the newsroom, because they see something like the potential of this story around the Olympics and they get excited. And if you're trying to explain, oh, AI can do this and that and this other thing and so on, journalists are generally some of the best BS detectors in the world, and that sets those meters off very quickly. So that helps in being able to frame a lot of the experiments and things like that, but generally there's still many more things that you can do than you actually have the time and resources to be able to do. So the next piece for us was figuring out how to make decisions between all these cool things that people were working on to know really where to place bets. And a lot of organizations over the past, I'd say decade in particular, have really thought about what their North Star is, right? There's a lot of literature about this. I think one of the famous examples is Netflix, where they decided pretty early on that what they cared about was number of minutes watched per month. So it didn't matter if they mailed you a DVD or you had Netflix running on your PlayStation. They would just track the number of minutes watched, and that would help them understand if they are doing a better job serving you as a customer or a worse job. They also don't really care what you're watching and things like that. In my experience, I found it incredibly hard for journalism, and I would wager this is true for many areas of digital humanities, to come up with a single business-minded metric when you're talking about so many things that have a factor of an influence on society, or what you're really trying to do is understand quality and improvements along those lines. So not to throw that whole framework away, but what we tried to do was something a little bit different and think about, for us, some of the principles of journalism and where we see opportunities to improve and think about trajectories of improvement, right? So just to run through a couple of these, this is not an exhaustive list, but I just wanted to float a few, for example. It's important, if you're an organization like the New York Times, for it to be comprehensive, right? That someone has a sense that when they're done reading the Times in a given day, that they have read all of the news that's fit to print, is the old motto. It's also important that it be accessible, and this has many definitions for us. That's language, it's literacy, but also a lot of the investments in visual journalism are about trying to make complex things easier to understand, not just for a wider audience, but for an audience where people are doing 30 things at the same time, and they just need to have that basic understanding. It's also important for the journalism to feel and be representative of the community it's serving, and for people of those communities to be able to see that. The reporters and the television anchors should look like the community that they're part of. The quotes and experts interviewed should be part of that community. And finally, if these things are all building on top of each other, all of those things help make the news coming out of an organization more trustable, but that's not the end of that story, right? Showing more of the evidence behind the reporting and giving people the opportunity to interrogate themselves is incredibly important as well. So we had all kinds of opportunities and experiments flying in from every direction. We could kind of start to understand which of these levers does that move, and that also helped us start to make decisions that were comparable to each other. So even if we had two ideas that would do completely different things, we could start to understand if that was going to move one of these more than the other. It's also helpful in the way I made this because there's an acronym, CART, which makes it easy to understand. There's the cart. If you have a cart, you need a horse. So the horse here is to be able to help make filtering decisions, to be able to, once you have a smaller set of things to work with, to be able to say, is it this idea, particularly when dealing with AI, going to introduce any harms to the newsroom, to readers, audiences, et cetera? Is it driving toward the outcomes that we actually care about? Are there additional risks that we need to weigh? Well, it's scale. We think about individual stories to be able to try things for the first time, but in the back of our heads, we need to be understanding, is this something that we would be able to use frequently? Is it, pose estimation going to be something we're applying a lot, or is it going back in the shelf for another 2 years until the next Olympics? And then finally, no matter what size organization you are, you're always trying to figure out how expensive are these things going to be, and again, is it something that you're going to be able to do repeatedly? So to use a quick example of how we ran through this a couple of years back, we used facial recognition on the live stream of the royal wedding of Harry and Meghan. And this, even at the time, was a controversial technology, and so there are many places where we knew we weren't going to ever use it. But one of the reasons why, in going through that checklist, particularly with the harms, where we felt comfortable with this, was that it was a highly public event. 1 billion people watched it. The people attending had no expectation of privacy. They were well known. We were able to train a model specifically because there were about 400 attendees. We knew who they were. So you can see we sort of went through this list and interrogated all of these questions. But it also gave us an opportunity not only to try the technology, but figure out the story. So here, what was important to us was less about being able to help you identify some of the most famous people in the world. I think a lot of us can pull Oprah Winfrey or Elton John out of a crowd. But it was to be able to answer questions about why somebody was there, right? Why is James Corden at the royal wedding? Why is Serena Williams at the royal wedding? So these lower thirds that would appear automatically would answer the question that you might have as you're formulating the question itself. And so being able to do that work with the newsroom and preparing all of that so that when this as a live event was something that basically in an automated fashion, we were able to deliver a more comprehensive, more accessible service was a worthwhile experiment. So finally, if you do all that stuff, the whole thing about being able to act is being poised to be able to move quickly when news happens, right? We can't always plan around something like the Olympics or a royal wedding or things like that. So you can do all of this kind of flying drones around in upstate New York, and anybody who wants to come to New York and fly drones, I'm always available. But you know, doing all of that prep work means that you're ready when something like this happens, a hurricane hitting the Bahamas, to be able to put people on the ground and be able to find the story, in this case about a Haitian community whose whole area was destroyed and they weren't allowed to rebuild, and be able to tell that story in a way that helps readers understand visually and viscerally what actually happened and show the evidence in a trustable way of what's going on there, but also be able to try new things to be able to, in this case, because this is using a technique called photogrammetry, be able to have a very large 3D rendering of this that you collect all the material of on the ground, but then after the fact decide exactly how you want to take readers through that story instead of relying just on the video capture itself. And so that gave us the opportunity to really know how we were going to tell this story in a better way than with just traditional material alone. So to recap, for us in being able to go from these really interesting areas of emerging technology all the way to some of the stories that you may have seen over the past handful of years, really understanding the jobs to be done from a consumer perspective was incredibly helpful to us. Thinking about stories as that core interaction, the thing people expect of the New York Times, the thing that we need to deliver, and not really trying to mess with the idea of a story, but just working within that framework. Deciding basically building off of some of these basic things like North Stars and things like that, but knowing that to really make the decisions that are most meaningful for us, we needed to invest a lot of time in understanding how to decide. And then finally being poised to act quickly and have people on staff with the skills to be able to go, for instance, get on a plane and go to the Bahamas to be able to actually make the work real for people at the end of the day. So with that, thank you very much, and turn it over to you.